All right, so ecology, if I didn't state before, technically means the study of one's house. And this includes all of our abiotic and biotic factors. When we start looking at behavior, remember that all behavior from an evolutionary standpoint, as behaviors develop, those behaviors, in order for them to be good behaviors, they are in some way going to have to enhance the fitness of the organism. So somehow the behavior increases the organism's ability to gain resources, to reproduce, or to raise young, to pass on those traits. And since a lot of behaviors have a genetic component, that you can have the natural selection of particular behaviors. So our first type of behavior is a fixed action pattern. So we remember that these are instinctive or innate behaviors that are going to be initiated by a sign stimulus, some type of external signal. And then once the behavior is initiated, the organism will complete that behavior even if the sign stimulus goes away. So remembering the gray-lag goose, when an egg rolls out of its nest, it pulls it back in to the nest. And so if an experimenter puts the egg in front of it, the gray-lag goose starts to drag the egg back. But if you remove the egg, it continues to do the neck and egg rolling behavior until it gets back to the nest, even though the egg isn't there. So that's what makes it innate and instinctive. Different kinds of movement behaviors. We've got two types. So kinesis is random. So organisms will move around until they just happen to run into a place that they like, and then they stay. So it's not directed towards something. If they just kind of wander around, probably a lot like grandparents' day. Grandparents just be wandering around until they find the right spot. Whereas taxis is going to be directed movement, and it's either going to be positive taxis or negative taxis. And we've got lots of different examples. We've got phototaxis. So plants grow towards light, moths move towards light. So that's positive phototaxis. Cockroaches run away from light. So that's negative phototaxis. Chemotaxis is toward or away from a particular chemical scent. This can be used in terms of marking territory. So dogs peeing every 20 feet when you take them on a walk. And then it can also be for communicating reproductive readiness by females to attract male. And then it can also be kind of chemical defenses. Some organisms will spray chemicals and then their predators will run away. And then of course, rheotaxis is the movement into the direction of flowing water. And so all of these behaviors, if they are going to be beneficial, need to increase some type of benefit for reproduction. So other things, we have imprinting, again, another innate behavior. So that is when young birds will fixate and bond to hopefully its parent. And then this increases survival because the babies are following the parent who's going to lead them to food and away from danger. It increases the reproductive fitness for the parent because the babies are going in, they're not just wandering away randomly. There is the time sensitive period where if the offspring does not do the imprinting within that first few minutes of hatching from the egg, then it's going to potentially imprint on the wrong thing or not imprint at all. And then it would just have a wandering random behavior. Migration is going to increase survival in that organisms will move towards better breeding ground, maybe where there's more food, away from harsh environments. So you have the winter migration of birds away from colder temperatures to warmer temperatures where there's more food. You have organisms migrating to better breeding grounds. And then you can have all of these different kinds of migration guiding. So stars or other types of bodies in the sky, the magnetoreception using landmarks, or potentially chemical migration as well. When we think about salmon migrating from the ocean upstream to spawn and then die, that they're following the scent of their home stream, which somehow they find and track. And therefore that's going to be beneficial for them because then they have that big reproductive event passing on their genes. This right here, this is a big flock of birds. This is called a murmuration. And the birds are all flying together as a protective mechanism. But then right before they roost for the night, they will do this big kind of flying around. And they think it's to help them kind of warm up their bodies before they sit down or rest for the night. But what's interesting is as they are flying, they never run into each other, but they'll all shift directions at the same time and kind of get these cool patterns in the sky. There's lots of interesting videos about that if you ever want to look it up. Other behaviors, optimal foraging behavior. This is where organisms have to balance the risk of finding their prey and the reward of how much food and nutrients they are going to get. So in terms of if you travel too far, then the caloric payoff might actually be negative. But then as you wander away from where potentially your protective area is, you are more exposed to predators. So there's all these different kinds of aspects that you have to, that they have to take into account in terms of getting their nutrients in their food. Agonistic behavior, this is where, this is sometimes known as warning behavior. So we have our cats hissing at each other. We have our dogs or our wolves growling. And so you can see some common behavior in this, that we see that the dog's ears are back, the cat's ears are back. So these are aggressive postures, the growling and baring the teeth, raising the hair on the back, making them look bigger. All of that is aggressive, but the idea is that we're going to basically just growl and hiss and yell at each other, and then maybe one of us will back down. And then we don't have to progress to the actual fighting stage. My favorite example of agonistic behavior is many years ago, more than 2 decades ago. My brother and I were coming out of Blockbuster. That's a place where you used to rent these things called videotapes. And we were going to get in the car, and this truck kind of swerves around this other car that was kind of starting to back out. And this guy gets out of the car, and he's probably like this tall, and he's probably like in his late 50s, and he just starts cursing out this young kid who is in the truck. And the kid in the truck gets out, and he's literally like this tall, and he's just huge, and he's jacked, and he's in this tank top, and this little old man's just yelling at him. And the kid rips off his shirt and just flexes in the guy's face. And the guy just gets in his car and just drives away. It was hilarious. So it happens with us as well. All right. So mating choice. This is where organisms are choosing their reproductive partners for some reason. And so elect, this is when the female is choosing, and you have large areas where the males are displaying. So that was the weird prairie grouse where they were all walking around doing their weird, I don't know what they were doing. And then the females would be like that one. And so then also with your peacocks showing off their traits, but typically whenever you have a polygamous system, this is when you will have the sexual dimorphism, where the males and females look different, and whether that is due to the males being more dominant and stronger and having to fight each other for the mating rights, or if it is something like with these birds where the females are choosing a particular type of characteristic for whatever reason. Same thing with the birds of paradise with all their dancing and nest building and all the different kinds of things. With different other behaviors, we have altruism. So this is where you have one organism that is at risk compared to the others. So this meerkat is on the lookout for predators, while the other ones are feeding and roaming around and not paying attention. So this one is getting less food at the time, so that is a cost, but also is more easily seen because in the upright position. But what is going to happen, then they will give off the warning calls to alert everybody to run away. And what we see in altruism is we have something known as the coefficient of relatedness. So you are more likely to help an organism that has a higher genetic affinity to you. So that means parents are more likely to help their offspring than they are to help their nieces or their nephews. But they're more likely to help their nieces and their nephews than they are random strangers. So same thing with animals, they're more likely to help the organisms that they are more closely related to, and the farther they get from that relation, the less likely there will be help. Other behaviors, we have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So this is where you're going to have some kind of signal. The big, main, clear difference is that classical conditioning is going to be an involuntary response to a stimulus. So this tends to be more physiological behaviors. So the dog starting to salivate, whereas operant conditioning is a voluntary behavior. So when I walk over to this drawer and I pull these out, some of you will have a negative response to seeing a Scantron. That's classical conditioning because you associate some kind of torture with Scantrons and you don't want to do it. Whereas operant conditioning is where you are doing something to earn a reward, whether that is, I'm going to work hard to get a better grade, or I'm going to, do all of my chores and my parents will give me money, or I will work hard at my job so I can keep it and so I can eat. All of those are operant things. So other some examples of animal communication that have shown up on the AP test. So you have different kinds of visual communication right here. They're written down there. I don't know if you can see them. So fireflies, they are going to have the blinking patterns. That is to attract mates. And so some fireflies will blink and attract the other species, and then the females will eat them as a trick. Of course, peacocks and then cobras as a kind of an agonistic behavior right there. So all of those agonistic behaviors, that's all of visual communication. It can be auditory as well with barking and growling and hissing. Elephants, interestingly, they can pass low frequency sounds through the ground and communicate with each other over miles of distance, and then they can sense it in their feet. And then of course, whales have their whale song, which they pass through the water. And there's lots of research being done on how things like sonar with submarines and things like underwater blasting for mining and drilling, how those, as those sound waves carry through the ocean, how they could potentially impact things like whales. And then wolves communicating, tactile. So, you know, when I get home, my cats rub up against me. They're telling me that they missed me, and or they want me to feed them, or they want me to let them out in the backyard. But that is a communication. And so all different kinds of things. Elephants also use tactile with their trunks. They communicate with each other. And then you've got chemical. So ants will leave little trails. When an ant finds a good food source, they'll leave a little chemical trail so the other ants can follow it. So if you've ever had ants in your house, and then like you may see one, and then suddenly there's like there's thousands of them, and they're all following these little trails to get to the food source, and they take it back to the nest. So you can just follow them back to their nest to annihilate them. And then you can also follow them to whatever they're trying to eat, and see what that source is. And then if that happens, it's also important to spray where they have made their little scent trail, so you clean it so they can't follow it anymore. All right. Some things that I have seen on usually this is going to be kind of stuff in multiple choice questions, maybe just one question on the test. Yes.
What about chemicals of plants?
So chemicals of plants, so they will communicate in several different ways. So a lot of it will be in response to predators and insects. So when insects land on plants, they will do several things. They will release signals in the air. So VOCs are volatile organic compounds. Those are basically just plant hormonal signals. And they will drift over to this plant, and then this plant will start manufacturing chemicals as a defense, either against the predators or it may be against a virus. And then they can also communicate those through their roots. And they do that by the interconnecting mycorrhizae, the fungal network. And that's that symbiosis between fungi and plant roots, where the fungus helps the plant absorb more nutrients. The plant gives them sugars, but those mycorrhizae actually connect plants together so that plants can share nutrients with other plants. But then they will also send these chemical signals as a warning for those other plants to start manufacturing defensive chemicals. Animals who demonstrate different kinds of cooperative behavior. So ants and insects, they are all, so this is also a form of altruism. So all the workers working for the queen, also you see that in the naked mole rats. The workers, they don't have the ability to even reproduce. So they are working to serve the transfer of the genes from the queen to other ones. Here in these musk ox, what they will do is they will actually surround the babies and the young to defend against predators. So that's a type of cooperative behavior. And the cooperative behavior that we're seeing is not that bison that has knocked this other one as the sacrificial member of the society. The cooperative behavior is the wolf pack, because a single wolf would not be able to take down a bison. So they work together as to increase their fitness. I mean, that's just, you know, I don't know if that was an intentional knockdown. It kind of looks like it, because He definitely
Oh, yeah.
puts the head down, and so that is not a good example of the coefficient of relatedness. So, all right, different ways in behavior that we regulate temperature, whether it is people or animals. So some of this is physiological, some of it is behavioral. So the physiological, of course, sweating, shivering, vasoconstriction is keeping the blood. So that's when the blood vessels tighten up and they keep the blood in the core. And then vasodilate is when the capillaries are going to flush out to take the blood to the surface to help heat escape from the body better. Some animals have the ability to increase their metabolic rate. We can do that very slightly. In our bodies, we have adipose tissue, which is fat. The majority of adipose tissue is white adipose tissue, but there's also something called brown adipose tissue. And animals that live in colder climates have higher levels of brown adipose tissue. And the reason that it is brown is it has a higher number of mitochondria in it. And what that tissue can do is when the organism gets cold, it can decouple the electron transport chain. So normally the electron transport chain, pumping hydrogen ions, making ATP, and in cold weather, they can decouple the ATP synthase mechanism. And so all of the energy that is being broken down from the glucose, then instead of getting converted into chemical energy of ATP, it gets converted into heat energy. So it's an adaptive mechanism to shift the metabolism from making ATP to make it even less efficient in terms of ATP production, but make it more efficient for heat production. And so that's because that tissue has lots and lots of mitochondria to help generate heat. If you're a dog and you don't have sweat glands, you'll have to pant a lot to get rid of that heat. And then some animals have the adaptations of growing thicker fur during the winter, shedding that fur in the spring. As was the indication on my floor yesterday when I was like, where did all of this fur come from? It's spring, and so we're shedding the layers. So other behavioral things, turtles moving into the warm sun. When animals are cold, they curl into a ball. Why? But how does that conserve heat? Surface area. Of course, then when it's hot, they'll spread out. Things will huddle together. And then your parents will say, you know, put on a sweater or contribute to the electric bill, one of the two. Ecosystem productivity, primary productivity, that's going to be what your plants fix. And then your secondary productivity is what the consumers fix from the primary producers. And of course, again, going from primary to producer to consumer, what's our energy transfer? 10%. And so it is very likely that you may get a diagram like this. And so you have your productivity of 300 joules. The caterpillar is eating that. The plant is losing energy as 100 joules. So then the caterpillar eats 200. However, out of that 200, the caterpillar is going to lose some of it in its poop. Not 100% efficient of extracting that. It loses as cell respiration. And so what it actually accumulates is 33 joules. So if you are asked to calculate the secondary productivity from this, your original amount was 300. And how much the caterpillar actually assimilated into its own tissue was 33. And then you would just do the percentage. That's going to be tick more than 10%. So if you are given a diagram, you have to subtract out all the negatives and see what was actually put in and calculate that. That's been on, that kind of question's been on there a few times. This weird map is showing the areas of productivity on the planet and where the ecosystems are most productive. And so you can see in the tropics, we've got lots of productivity. And then we can see that the Arctic regions, where are they? Basically zero productivity. But, you know, of course, this is in danger because we keep cutting them down to, you know, more cattle, more beef, hooray. So that's just kind of so your most productive biome is your tropical rainforest. What's your most productive aquatic biome?
Like marsh.
So it depends on the question. What is it per square meter? It's actually like, it's like marshes and algal beds, but is that the most productive? No, it's the open ocean. Even though per square meter, the open ocean is tiny, the open ocean is kind of big. So it makes a lot. All right, so then energy flow, again, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. That is an average. Things that are endothermic have a lower than 10% efficiency. Things that are ectothermic have a higher efficiency because we waste a lot of our energy as heat production. And so moving up, it's always going to be 10%. So that is not only going to affect your energy, it also affects your number of organisms and your overall biomass. So you get those pyramids of productivity. There's an energy pyramid, there's a biomass pyramid, there's a numbers pyramid, but everything really goes back to the amount of energy, because as we are losing more and more energy, there's less to support those upper levels. So that's why all ecosystems have a limited number of trophic levels, because you eventually run out of energy. All right, things affecting primary productivity, things affecting population growth and carrying capacity. This is both number 8 and number 12. So when you get to number 12, just write C number 8. We don't have to write it twice. So all these different things, we've got things that are density dependent and density independent. So these ones increase with population. And then density independent is the population size doesn't matter. So all of these things that are in the red, those are the density independent factors. So basically, if you have a tornado come through, it's going to kill a bunch of stuff. And it doesn't matter that the population is low or high, stuff's going to die. But all these other ones, these factors increase as the population increases. So more competition for food and water. So if there are more organisms, the competition becomes more severe. Same thing with living space. Disease is going to spread faster and be at a higher rate than when the population is high versus when it's low. So again, back to our unfilled days of COVID, spread out. Why? That lowers the population density. And so and then remember that parasitism is basically just another form of disease, just the organisms are larger. And then predation You will have higher levels of predation when the population of the prey is higher. But climate, it kills the stuff that it kills, whether there's a lot of them or not a lot of them. And then the same thing with human disturbances. And how we are great at helping other things live. Good. What are they or what's it mean? So that just, so like when, you know, if a tornado comes ripping through, it's just going to kill stuff. If there's a higher population, it will kill more things. But yeah, so its impact is independent of whether the population is high or low. Death is still going to occur. All right, so some quick practice calculations. So a population has 500 individuals with 25 births and 15 deaths. So we want to calculate the birth rate, the death rate, and the growth rates, and then how long it will take for the population to double. So simply, how do we calculate the birth rate? 25 over 500. That is 0.05. How would I calculate the death rate? And that is, and then I can calculate the growth rate two ways. I could do 0.05 minus 0.03, or I could do 25 minus 15, which would be 10 over 500. But either way, it's going to be 0.02. So do I just write 0.02? No, because on the AP test, we always show our work and how we got there. So we can do 0.05 minus 0.03. Or we could have done 25 minus 15 over 500. And we should also be doing our units, births, and this doesn't give a time, so we're going to assume years. You can do growth per year. You could do individuals per year, something like that. Now, how would we calculate our doubling time? That is the rule of 70. So we're going to take our growth rate as a percent, and we divide that into 70. So we would say 35 years until it doubled, approximately. Okay, so basic calculations. These are typically on there. They're typically on there in the multiple choice. Sometimes they will be on there in a free response as one of the subparts. And what can happen is they can give you I've seen it as, you know, a graph. And they've got one line, which is the birth rate, and then one line, which is death rates. And then they'll give you, they'll say at point X, you know, what is the, and then you have to pick out your points and do the math. Or they'll give you a data table, and then you have to pick the numbers out and do it from that. So. All right, if the population is growing exponentially, we have two equations. We have dn over dt equals r times n, and we've got dn over dt equals r times n times k minus n over K. One of these is the exponential, one of these is the logistic. Which is which?
Exponential.
First one is exponential. And then this is logistic. Do you have to remember that? No. Why? It's on your equation sheet. And it's labeled exponential growth, logistic growth, and it gives you all of the variables. You don't have to remember anything except I should use that equation. So if we are using our exponential equation, the population above is growing exponentially. How many individuals can be expected to be produced in the next year? So dn over dt. What would I use for? What would I use for R? 0.02. And N is the. And how many individuals were in that population? 500. And that would be your answer. Which is. So. What is this? 10? All right. So that's 10. So then your new population, what would your new population be? That would be 510 because you would add them. Or you could take, if you take 1.02 times 500, that would just give you the 510. So this is just telling you how many it's going to add. This would tell you what the new population will be. So. All right, if the population above is at half of its carrying capacity, what does that immediately tell you? You're using the logistic equation because what does K equal? Carrying capacity. So it says if the population above is at half its carrying capacity, so currently its number is 500. And if that's half the carrying capacity, then it means K equals 1,000. So then we would plug that in, dn over dt. R is still 0.02. 500 for n times 1,000 minus 500 over 1,000. So that would be 1,000 minus 500 is 500. 500 over 1,000 is 1/2. 1/2 times 500 is 250. 250 times 0.02 will be half of the previous. So that would give you an answer of 5. So, of course, you will have calculators unless you don't bring one. But I think all of the math on there should be able to be done without a calculator. But it will just suck up your time, especially if you have to do long division. So, and then you have to remember how to do long division without a calculator. So, potentially. So we will go over that this week. So I have a whole math package. So, all right, R versus K selected organisms. R selected, these are things that grow exponentially, so that the R is referring to R in the exponential equation. K selected things tend to live around their carrying capacity. So things that are R selected tend to be smaller because they can reproduce faster. Things that are K selected tend to be larger, although not always. These just kind of, they are density independent, so they will just grow until they get to their best conditions, then they start growing exponentially. Usually lots of early death. Here we're gonna have usually more of them making it to adulthood because you will have a lot of parental care. And so these tend to have weaker selective pressure or weaker competition, whereas these have stronger competition because they are living near the carrying capacity, so your resources are more limited. Early fast reproduction tends to have that similarity where there's a lack of parental care here, typically very short-lived, longer-lived species down there. So examples of our selected things would be things like mice, mosquitoes, and then case selected, the best example would be things like elephants and people. So. All right, where are we in this?
14.
The number right there. But there's a system. All right. So, so when we look at the graphs of how R and K selected populations will grow, we see that R selected species tend to have wild fluctuations. Typically as seasons change, you'll have a spike. So like aphids right now, their populations are going crazy. They're getting lots and lots of aphids, but then eventually it's going to get cold and their populations will crash. And then, so a lot of this can be seasonal. Whereas your K selected pattern is going to fluctuate around that carrying capacity. And K selected species, they tend to be, these are more stable and more adapted to their environment. Good. All right, basic human age structures. Maybe one question in the multiple choice, although years past, this is typically before the AP test switched format. Sometimes it's popped up on the free response. If it does pop up on the free response section, it's probably one of the shorter questions, total guess. But basically, remember that you've got your pre-reproductive ages down here. So these are your kids. So these are going to be ages 0 to 14. Your reproductive ages are typically 15 to 54, and then post-reproductive 55 plus. And so what this shows us, this is typically going to be a population that is, you know, an underdeveloped country. So you don't have lots of healthcare, lots of resources, but has a great potential for growth. So if this got an influx of food and medicine and a more stable economy, then all of these young people would make it to the reproductive stage. And then your population would start to really grow. More stable populations, so this is like an industrialized, probably first world country, and then this is a first world highly developed country that has gotten beyond where they're at a negative growth where people are having fewer and fewer kids. So
Question marks like which would correlate to an R selected, K selected. which
so
would
R
actually-
selected would be more like this because it has the potential for growth. So if we're talking like, you know, mosquitoes, very low population, but if, you know, if you think about if climate change happens and we stop having freezes and cold winters, their populations would just stay around all year. And then they would just grow rapidly. And then this would be more K-selected, kind of a stable environment, and therefore stable population. All right, lots of populations will grow rapidly. Maybe all the predators die from some disease, so then the prey no longer have that selective pressure. So then they start growing rapidly. And so you may get some exponential growth even with a K-selected population, but then they'll eventually overshoot that carrying capacity and then they will die back. So then over time, your actual graph would look like that if you averaged it out. But overshoot and die back, overshoot is when the population grows very quickly outpaces the carrying capacity. So then the competition becomes extremely fierce and lots of things die. Usually lots of things die because of disease, because then disease starts passing through and then your population crashes. All right, boom bust cycle. So if we look at this, so favorable growth conditions, population grows quickly, maybe nutrients get depleted and then everything crashes. Maybe population gets high, environment changes, population crashes, but just a boom bust cycle is up, down. This can sometimes be seen in your predator prey cycles, where you have this kind of co-evolution and also co-relationship within the population growth and dieback. So lots of prey, lots of food for the predators. Predator population gets too high, prey population falls, not enough food for the predators, their population. So this is just showing the interrelationship of how the populations influence each other, causing rise and fall due to their relationships. Basic reproductive strategies, going to our semelparity and our iteroparity. So again, semelparity, that's kind of your, this is sometimes known as Big Bang reproduction, or one giant go at reproduction, make lots and lots of babies, don't take care of them, hope for the best, and some of them make it to adulthood. The other strategy is focusing on parental care. Fewer babies, larger babies, take care of those babies, make sure they make it to adulthood. So our best example of semelparity is salmon. Semel sounds like salmon. And then iteroparity, elephants. Pregnant for 2 years, one baby, take care of it for 13 years before she'll get pregnant again. And so that's even more extreme than humans, which are also iteroparity, but humans can reproduce more frequently, and their babies are much smaller than an elephant baby. What about semelparity? So some things will reproduce more than once. So like sea turtles will reproduce every year. But like your most extreme case is like salmon. They lay all their eggs and then they die. So this is a continuum. So it's not your either semelparity or your iteroparity. There can be gradations from the most extreme semelparity to your most extreme iteroparity. So like sea turtles, they reproduce a lot, but they don't do any parental care, but they'll lay hundreds of eggs and that's it. So that's still considered semelparity, even though they have multiple reproductive events. So, and a lot of it has to do with how often and how well the offspring survive. So with our type 1, this would be iteroparity. Because we're getting lots of parental care to keep those babies alive. Your type 3 would be your semelparity, lots and lots of infant mortality, But once they get to a certain size, so think about a sea turtle, once it gets big enough, it's going to live for a long period of time. And then at the heteroparity, most things will live to adulthood, but then once that population gets to a certain age, so, people, we're talking about 80, and then people all just after 80, you get, lots and lots of people are dying off because they've reached the age span. And then your type 2 is just that constant random death. So your type 2 tends to be low trophic level organisms. So things like rodents and bugs that are eaten by lots of different things. Good. Yes. All right. Our Simpson's diversity index. So again, we'll do this again in our math soon. But again, you take your number. So you do 10 koi fish divided by 28, square that. 3 turtles divided by 28, square that. 5 frogs by 28, square that. 10. Add them all up, subtract that from 1. Do that for the lake, except you're doing 20 over 1440, 60 over 1440. Whichever one is higher is more diverse. So that's how you would figure out I've yet to see this on the AP test. But maybe this year's the year. So, and remember that diversity is about how many species you have, but also how even those numbers are. So you could still have something with 100 species, but one of those is 99% of all the population. That's not necessarily super diverse. So primary, secondary succession. One thing you need to, it's about the soil. So primary is no soil to start. Secondary, soil is present. So your forest fire, your soil is already there. So this is going to be much faster. And this is going to be very slow because you have to build up that soil over time. Mutualism, both things benefit. Examples that you should know, legume roots and bacteria, plants, and bees and flowers is good. Plants and fungi, the mycorrhizae again. And then just they'll give examples, and then you just have to know both are benefiting. So that's mutualism. Parasitism, plus minus, ticks, mosquitoes, leeches, tapeworms, mistletoe. Predation, that's a positive, negative. The happy Coca-Cola polar bear right there. Good for the predator, not so great for the seal. Mimicry, so your Batesian mimicry, this is where you have something that is harmless. Looks like something that is harmful. Sometimes that's called parasitic because it's beneficial for this, but not beneficial for this. So maybe that's more commensalism because it doesn't really do this any harm. But then Müllerian mimicry is that they're both harmful. So that is a positive reinforcement in that cycle. That's the mutual benefit. So that's what's called an honest signal because it can actually harm you, whereas a deceptive signal, it's not going to.
What about commensalism?
Commensalism is +0. So did I not have that? So that'd be like barnacles on a whale, orchids on a tree, bald eagles eating garbage out of a dumpster. problem in Alaska. So, all right.
Example of facing.
So it would be that fly looks like a bee, but it's not, or the hummingbird, moth. Not a hummingbird is harmful, but they can look like bees sometimes too. Competitive exclusion principle. This is where you have a strong competitor out competing a weak competitor. So that reduces your weak competitor from its fundamental niche where it could live to where it actually lives. And competitive exclusion, this reduces biodiversity. Because you are now having more of species one than you are of having species two. And you could potentially have species one completely out competing species two, and it becomes what's called locally extinct. So it's not that the species is completely gone, it's just gone from that particular area. Similar is resource partitioning. So you do have a smaller niche, so you're not fulfilling that fundamental niche in this area of competition. Basically, no one is there. So there's just no overlap. So this reduces competition and tends to increase biodiversity. Because now both species are able to exist more easily because the competition level and all of the energy that is wasted in the competition can now go into finding food and reproduction. Keystone predators, that's going to be beneficial because that's that top-down trophic cascade where by regulating those primary consumers, it helps regulate the entire ecosystem. So wolves in Yellowstone, great example of that. Deer are a menace. Invasive species, bad, decreased biodiversity because they lack predators and they're natural disease causing organisms. So they can just grow very, very, very fast. And then they tend to outcompete the local population, decreasing biodiversity. Ecological disturbances can actually be good because it opens up new niches. And so if the forest, so when you get a short forest fire, then you get lots of growth of new kinds of plants, which make new niches. And therefore you get more biodiversity with occasional ecological disturbances. The biomes, review those. Climate, what are the most two important things for climate? Is temperature and precipitation. So, and then the combination of those two are going to determine your climate, which determines your plant life, which determines your animal life. Water cycle, it happens. Carbon cycle, important for what process? Photosynthesis and cell respiration. Nitrogen cycle, important for what biomolecules? Proteins and nucleic acid. Phosphorus cycle, important for nucleic acid in the backbone. Sulfur, important for proteins. Goodbye. Last one, done. Yeah, not enough enthusiasm, people. Much better, thank you.
Here you are.